Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us to the special education event. It is really, we want to discuss the threats that are currently coming from the government against the right to protest, and also concretely against the right of juries to take a verdict and be involved in the decision making. Personally, coming from a country without a jury service, Germany, it is very, very different there. The justice system is very clearly part of the ruling class and the establishment. Judges are part of the establishment. They are there to preserve the status quo. You might be lucky and get a nicer one, but that's about it. To be able to appeal to a jury of your peers is an entirely different matter. It gives you a chance to explain what you did and why you did it, your motives, etc., especially in a country like Britain when there is no actual written law you can appeal to. Justice is very different from a sort of legal justice, so morality can be very different to what's legally right. And in our own organizations on the left, where they are democratic, that's exactly how we should deal with most issues. To have a jury of your peers making a decision, not some leader. A future socialist society I would also probably not leave it to one or two judges to sit in judgment over people. And that's exactly, I think, why our jury system is under attack. It actually works. And in recent years, there have been a number of high-profile acquittals by juries of those taking non-violent direct action, from the Colston 4 to members of Extinction Rebellion and, of course, the Palestine Action activists. They have embarrassed the government and outraged sections of the media. There might be people who think this does not affect them. I'm not a direct action activist, etc. I might even disagree with some of the actions that Just Stop Oil are doing. But this is very much the thin end of the wedge. In Scotland, for example, the jury system is under attack too. There it's being sold as a sort of progressive attempt to get more rapists convicted because, judges are usually so in tune with women's rights, so instead of juries, they want judges to take action there. But clearly, this is also very much part of a more widespread attempt to stop us from protesting and to speaking out. There's a number of bills that have recently been put through or being put through. And we want to discuss tonight what's at stake and also what we can do about it. And I'm very pleased to have as the first speaker, Tim Crosland, the part of a campaign that wants to save our juries. It's a call to campaign, Save Our Juries. So be very pleased to hear from him what's at stake and what we can do about it. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much, Tina, for inviting me to this meeting, and thank you to everyone who's been stepping up to resist the government's program of repression, however you can, in whatever ways that you can. So yes, I'm Tim Crosland from the Climate Justice Charity Plan B. I'm not going to talk in any detail about the wider program of repression, the unlawful and racist deportations, the propping up of repressive regimes around the world, the new threat of 10 years imprisonment for peaceful protest, the injunctions which are allowing the wealthy to buy up justice, and the criminalization of people just for planning a peaceful protest. I mean, that's part of this wider program. But given the violence, the extreme repression that is happening now, I feel we've got a duty to our brothers and sisters everywhere to be as effective as possible in our response, and that means targeting the Achilles heel in the government's program. And as Tina's sketched out in that opening, that is, at least as I see it, it's trial by jury of 12 randomly selected members of the public, which is something that is very deep in our legal tradition here. It's the Achilles heel for three reasons. As the government escalates its program of repression, more and more cases end up before the Crown Court, and that means jury trial. In other words, once you start locking people up for a long time and threatening them with charges of public nuisance or criminal damage of a certain level, that means jury trial. And a large part of the public, when they hear about what's happening, when they get good information, maybe for the first time, they're on our side. They're not on the government side. And we only need 3 out of 12 of any jury to block a conviction. That's just 25%. And if that sounds a bit abstract, I mean, just a quick reminder of how this has been working in practice the last few years. And this is, just a few of the cases. It's not all of the cases. April 21, 6 of the Shell 7 were acquitted after damaging Shell's HQ and admitting the damage. And the 7th, in fact, just for practical reasons, wasn't able to attend that trial. In January 22, the Colston 4, acquitted by a Bristol jury for toppling the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston into Bristol Harbour. And you'll remember the government reaction to that and the reaction from the tabloid and the right-wing press. January 23, jury acquitted Insulate Britain campaigners for an M4 roadblock. February 23, Burning Pink campaigners cleared by a jury after pouring pink paint over Tory and Labour HQs. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Brookhouse 3 cleared of blocking deportations to Jamaica after they persuaded a jury that there was a duty to resist a violent and racist government. And those were all acquittals, not a hung jury. That meant at least 10 out of the 12 jurors found in the defendant's favour, even though there was no dispute in any of those cases about what had been done. Just imagine from the government's point of view, from the court's point of view, how that feels. They haven't really got control over that. It's the one bit they've not got control over. And it's massively embarrassing because they try and present direct action as interfering with the public. And when the public gets to vote on this in a court of law and sides with those taking action against it, that's a hard thing for them to deal with. And they can't abolish jury trials, even if they might want to. When Dominic Raab was pushing his British Bill of Rights, and they did a consultation around that, trial by jury was the most popular right of all. I think out of 2,000 consultation responses, 1,700 said trial by jury, the most important feature of the Bill of Rights. It resonates deep in the heart, even of their conservative heartlands. So what's been happening, and in fact, I mean, this has been happening through some of those acquittals. It's not as though this is all, brand new. They've been trying to maintain the appearance of jury trials while turning those jury trials into show trials. And they've been doing that by banning those engaged in campaigns of political resistance from explaining their motivations and beliefs, disallowing or ignoring relevant evidence and witnesses, including expert testimony about the government's criminality and failures to follow scientific advice, telling juries that motives, even if articulated, are irrelevant and they should be ignored. More recently, even sending people to prison just for using the terms climate change and fuel poverty in court. Banning references to a jury's right to acquit a defendant as a matter of conscience, threatening Palestine Action and others with contempt of court just for raising it, even though that's a centuries-old tradition of our law, even though that principle is literally set in marble at the original entrance of the Old Bailey and is taught to our school kids. I mean, it's on the syllabus, it's on the O-level syllabus. the trial of Penn and Mead from 1670 that establishes that principle. And then they've been arresting and referring for prosecution those who try and remind jurors of their right to make decisions on their conscience. They're not denying that right exists, they're just not allowing the jury to know about it. And then they're directing the jury that defences such as necessity, proportionality, or reasonable excuse are not available, effectively the judge directing a jury to enter a verdict of not guilty, rendering jury trial completely meaningless. I want to come on now to the response to that, or one part of the response. I mean, other things have been happening too, and it's not to overlook those things, but there was a legal observer to some of the direct action. Trudy Warner, 68, she's a retired social worker. She was so outraged, I mean, very genuinely by what she was seeing in court, that she stood outside the jury entrance with a placard that says, jurors have a right to make decisions on their conscience. And as far as she was concerned, she was just literally upholding the law. That is the law of jury nullification. And she was arrested for literally upholding the law. She was sent to the Old Bailey. The judge at the Old Bailey said, this is so serious, I'm going to refer you to the Attorney General. So she's now facing a possible contempt of court charge, or even perverting the course of justice charge before the Attorney General. And then a few others followed suit and they were referred to the Attorney General too. And then on May the 15th, 24 of us, mixed group of people. There was a group of Quakers there, some of us direct action people, health professionals, a priest, a mix of people. We sat outside in a London Crown Court around 9 in the morning near the jury entrance, just sitting down, just holding those same signs. Juries have a right to make decisions on their conscience. That's the law. We handed in a letter to the judge saying, this is why we think it's important to uphold the law. Being a judge, you know, you probably think that's important too. Nobody moved us. Nobody came and talked to us. We weren't arrested. We came back and did it the next day. Again, nothing happened to us immediately, but the judge did the same. He's referred us to the Attorney General for contempt of court. And the Attorney General has now got a dilemma, because she can either knock back not just Judge Reed, but really all the other judges around the country who are banning people from defending themselves and banning people from explaining themselves to the jury. She, in this, you know, tough on protest government, can go, well, actually, no, the judges are going too far here. So difficult. That's not a great look for this Attorney General. Or she can prosecute all 24 of us for literally upholding the law and expose the deep repression of this government to full public view. And this is one where I think the public are going to be a little bit surprised at what's happening. We're not disrupting the public here. We're empowering the public. We're reminding the public, which are juries, of their power to hold power to account. As we sat there outside in the London Crown Court, one of the jurors said to us, thank you, thank you for doing this. And that trial ended up in a hung jury. And after that, and after news of the referral, a real Spartacus moment, loads of people saying, we want to do this. When's the next sign holding? Because there's more of us. And so this is the start of the campaign. I know I need to wrap up now. Sorry, Tina. Save Our Juries. This will be a campaign of sign holding outside courts, blank signs symbolizing the repression that's occurring, also jury conscience signs. The objectives, eventually, this is not going to be sustainable for the Attorney General to keep prosecuting us. Eventually, the courts and the government are going to have to retreat. That means we'll be able to inform jurors of their constitutional right. That's going to mean more acquittals, and that's going to empower all our direct action movements. And it's also something in the court of public opinion. It helps us tell the story of the wider oppression that is occurring in a neat little courtroom drama. That judge trying to tell the jury they have no real power, that's a microcosm of neoliberalism and the lie of democracy that we've got in one little scene. And I think it helps us to communicate that. So that's the program. It's only powerful if we can do this as a collective across all our movements. It can link us as a movement of movements. So this is a call out for everyone to get involved on the 28th, Wednesday next week at 6:30. There'll be a briefing for campaign organisers. The first mass action around this is planned for Gail Bradbrook's trial, which begins the week of the 17th of July. And yes, this is in a movement in solidarity with all direct action movements facing repression. It's simple, it's accessible, it feels really good sitting out there, upholding the law, understanding that the times are such that upholding the law has become a radical act. And it's one with the potential to unravel this government's program of violence, racism, and repression.
Important introduction to our meeting tonight and a very good overview. I think another opportunity or might be the sentencing of Tony Greenstein and the other LBIT activists, which looks like might be July the 10th, might be later than that. We'll keep comrades informed as well. So thank you very much, Tim, for outlining this. Comrades, if you want to get involved, that part of a campaign, a group that wants to get involved, that either contact Tim or contact the Labour Left Alliance. We can pass on the details of this meeting as well. info@labourleft.org. info@labourleft.org. That's the one. And Tim, maybe you could put the details in the chat as well. That'd be great, and how to contact the campaign, which I think is a very, very important campaign. And as I said, you don't have to be a direct action activist to think that this is a really important campaign to fight against this undermining of the jury system. This will affect us all sooner or later. This is just a trial, isn't it? It's an attempt to undermine our rights and our rights to protest more widely. It's a hugely important campaign to fight back. So thank you very much for outlining that. Our next speaker is a comrade from Just Stop Oil, and we're very pleased to have him with us.
Yeah, so my name's Kush. I'm 33. I'm a doctor from London, and I've been supporting Just Stop Oil for just over a year now. And I'll give you just a very quick rundown of our demand. It's essentially that we recognize that we're in a climate crisis where we need serious action. And our demand is that the government stop all new fossil fuel licenses. But at the moment, they're planning on going ahead with over 100 new fossil fuel licenses and extractions and consents, etc., including projects like Rosebank that is in the North Sea, that we know that if that alone gets approved, it'll take us beyond the UK's carbon budget. So they're incompatible with sort of human welfare. And so we can't see any logical reason why they should be approved. And so given the government is sort of directly in opposition of advice from the world's leading scientists, the UN, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, we felt no need than to go into what's called non-violent civil resistance. And that involves taking part in a number of actions that can be deemed not to be lawful, but we do so purposefully to draw attention to the fact that what is happening is unjust. And so Just Stop Oil has taken sort of a broad range of tactics since it began its campaign at the beginning of last year. First targeting oil and gas infrastructure and actually trying to shut down the gears of the industry by blockading oil and gas terminals and actually preventing sort of the lorries carrying the fuel from leaving the depots. And that was a campaign that lasted around 4 weeks in April of last year. Then come October of last year, there was a campaign of roadblocks. And this was in and around London with the hope that actually we would bring the focus of the campaign away from the industry and more directly towards the government, because they were the ones that we were demanding made the change, because ultimately it was their responsibility on whether or not to approve these licenses that the fossil fuel companies then go on to extract the oil and gas from. So it was all focused around putting pressure on Downing Street. And as you'll remember, it was a time of great political flux in October of last year. But despite that, we persisted and we went out every single day in October. We had a rally outside 10 Downing Street, and we had a number of road blockades that took place across roads in London, where again, people would block the road until the point that they were arrested. And it was a campaign that got headlines and got the sort of demand into the media, in large part, unfortunately, because of the disruption that it causes. And disruption in and of itself is not our aim. Our aim is to simply put pressure on the government. But we recognize that when the government is not listening to rhyme or reason, then unfortunately this sort of process of non-violent civil resistance where you do cause disruption is something that does put pressure on them. And it was a system that worked, but obviously there's very limited capacity for growth in a direct action campaign like that, where you are asking people to take part in things that are quite black and white illegal. And so I supported the campaign, but more so from a periphery, because I work as a doctor. I didn't want sort of arrest to influence my ability to work and progress in my career and travel and get visas, etc., etc. And so one of the changes that they made after the October campaign was they realized that actually there is this tactic called slow marching, which is not illegal, because you are allowed to march in the road, and there is case law that shows that you are allowed to cause disruption with your protest by marching in a public highway. And that is permitted under case law. And so we thought, well, why don't we do something that is disruptive, but is also legal, so gives this ability for far more people to become involved in the movement and grow the movement and allow much greater mobilization. And that's sort of where I came in, because I was like, yes, this is a tactic that I can get on board with. I'm keen for taking part in action that does not fall foul of the law, but still allows there to be some disruption and therefore some pressure on government. But what we've seen is that at that same time, the government has been trying to restrict the right to protest. And when it comes to policing a protest, the police have to weigh up two different things. So what protects us and our rights to protest is our European Convention of Human Rights. And in that, there's a number of different articles. And some of the human rights that we have are things called absolute rights. And so like freedom from torture is an absolute right. There is no exception in the clause on that. It just says no one should be tortured. But some of them, including freedom of expression, so freedom of speech, freedom to assembly, these are all conditional rights, or there's another phrase for it, but it's a right that you have, but the government is allowed to put limits on it. And sometimes quite rightly, because actually, yeah, we should have freedom of expression, but that should not go unchallenged, because that shouldn't then give you a right to have hate speech and racism and misogyny and things like that. Those should still be things that can be controlled and made legal. But the wording of the European Convention on Human Rights around things like freedom of assembly and freedom of expression is that things that cause, let me just find the precise wording, but the national governments can limit these freedoms if it is for the prevention of disorder or crime. And so the government can create laws such as the Public Order Act that then define what it considers to be too criminal and therefore justify arrest. So the police have always got to balance this. They've got to allow us to protest, but not allow crime. And you're like, okay, well, where do they draw that line? And what we've seen is that actually over the last year, they've been changing they've been moving the goalposts, and they've been changing what used to be serious disruption to now being anything more than minor disruption, and anything more than minor disruption being classified as anything that's noisy, anything that disturbs more than one person, anything that disturbs anyone who's even passing through the area. And so you can see that in and of itself makes things a lot more challenging. And sort of an example of how these things have become like completely over the top and out of sort of sense is a protest that I took part in on the day of the coronation. It seems like we've got someone just okay. So I took part in a protest on the coronation, again in support of Just Stop Oil. And the aim was that a group of us would attend the line of the march. We would not disrupt the actual procession itself. We would not take anything that could be seen in any way, shape or form to be criminal, because we knew that the government had just brought in the new Public Order Act, and they were sort of already exercising their sort of brute force almost to shut down protests. Because back at the end of April, I'd been slow marching with Just Stop Oil, and we were able to march for sort of two and a half hours through the streets of London without our marches being brought to an end. As the week went on, the police got more and more fed up of us. And actually, by the end of the week, they were allowing us to march by about an hour and a half before they would issue something called a Section 12 that would then deem that procession to become unlawful unless we moved out of the road. The following week was when the Public Order Act came in. And when the Public Order Act came in, that sort of allowing us to march in the road went from being an hour and a half to being about 15 minutes. And you're just like, well, how are you supposed to mount any form of effective protest if you're being taken out of the road within minutes? And that continued to be the case for the rest of that week. And so we were like, well, look, let's go to the coronation. Let's not do anything illegal, and let's see how far the police go. And they kind of showed their face, because actually there was a group of about 18 of us, 13 in one spot and 5 in another. We had gathered around 4 in the morning. One person who was going to be joining us in the group was arrested before they could even meet the rest of the group. And they were arrested simply as they were coming out of the train station. How the police spotted them, I have no idea, but they came up to them and told the person their full name. So they'd been looking for them in advance. They'd been using some sort of surveillance. And then the rest of us, we all got arrested at around 9 o'clock in the morning, again, before any of us had actually begun the protest, because we were standing in a group of monarchists and we knew that we were going to get kicked out and yelled at if it was evident what we were there for. So we were all standing with T-shirts that said Just Stop Oil and flags that said Just Stop Oil. The T-shirts were hidden from view and the flags were in our pockets. And we weren't protesting. We were simply standing there and waiting. And yet about 50 TSG, who are like the British equivalent of SWAT officers, sort of came along, grabbed us, cuffed us, took us to the side, and then searched us. And it was only then when they searched us that they could actually even see that we were wearing these sort of t-shirts that said "Just Stop Oil." So obviously there was a massive police operation underway that day, but the sort of justification that's come out from the police following that. So I mean, that day I was arrested, I got taken to a police station, I was held in custody for 14 hours, and then I was subsequently released without charge. But I was arrested on 3 separate counts. One was conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, one was conspiracy to obstruct a public highway, and one was breach of the peace. Some others also were threatened with further arrest for things like handling stolen goods, simply because they had their own bank card in their pocket, and when the police asked them their name, they didn't give them their name straight away, because you're not legally required to do so until you get taken to into police custody at the station. So they're like, well, I'm not required to give it to you. And they're like, well, we'll arrest you for handling stolen goods. You're like, but what grounds do you have to believe that we've stolen this? Anyway, the point was that we've not been charged, but we've all been released on pre-charge bail. And we've questioned this, and the police seemed to stick to the line that they had intelligence, that we were going to do X, Y, Z, that we were going to throw paint, that we were going to use rape alarms, that we were going to lock onto things. They searched us all, we had none of that stuff, and yet they still continue to arrest us. They are unwilling to share the information of the intelligence on which they based our arrests. And there was then a inquiry held by MPs into what had happened on the day of the coronation, actually by the Home Affairs Committee. And there were 4 groups of people who were arrested that day. So there was ourselves at Just Stop Oil. There was Animal Rising, who are a separate non-violent civil resistance group, focusing mainly on animal rights and animal welfare. They were based 5 miles away from the coronation, in an office in East London that is also used by Just Stop Oil. And so that location was raided, and everyone that was there was arrested simply for supposedly being Just Stop Oil, even though they were actually there for a training event for a completely different thing. So those were 2 of the groups. The third group was Republic, who are the anti-monarchist group, of which I think 6 or 8 people were arrested. That was a group that sort of collaborated with police well in advance of the event and told them exactly what they were planning on doing and when they were planning on doing it. And they did everything that they were planning on doing, and they still got arrested. And then the 4th group was actually not even a protest group at all, but was a group of Westminster City Council volunteers called the Night Stars, who go around handing out, essentially trying to look after young women who may be drunk on a Friday or Saturday night in central London and make sure that they can get home safely, by handing out bottles of water, by handing out slippers in case they've taken off their high heels and they have nothing to wear. And one of the things that they carry are these anti-spiking kits, so that people can test whether or not their drinks have been spiked. And in that kit is also a rape alarm. And so the police said that because they had intelligence that rape alarms were going to be used to attack horses, they arrested these 3 Westminster City Council volunteers, even though actually that was a group that was sanctioned by the Home Office, and it was the Home Office who paid for these rape alarms to be carried around by these people, and it was in collaboration with the Met Police. And so when the Public Accounts Committee got together, not the Public Accounts, sorry, the Home Affairs Committee got together, they wanted to question the police on what had happened, and they wanted to hear from some of the groups that were involved. And they invited Republic, and they invited the Westminster City Council volunteers. As Just Stop Oil or Animal Rising, we were not invited to give evidence to that committee. And so we actually proactively sought them out and contacted them and said, well, look, we were actually the largest group of protesters who were arrested that day. And what happened to them was just as unlawful in terms of the arrest as what happened to us. The only difference is that we're a group who does take part in some actions that are against the law, but this action was not against the law. And therefore, actually, we should be protected under the law in exactly the same way as Republic or the Night Stars were. But they basically told us that they weren't interested in taking any evidence from Just Stop Oil. And they, even though we sent them sort of written testimonies of what had happened and our views, they said, we're not accepting any evidence. And so we attempted to attend the meeting in Parliament because it's an open meeting that's held in public. And we sat there for about half an hour simply listening to the MPs questioning the police and thinking it was absolutely ludicrous, the sort of line of questioning that a lot of it was going down, where they were trying to, one, just ignore the fact that the largest group of people arrested that day hadn't been invited and almost weren't even considered as part of the issue. But two, like drawing this sort of distinguishing between the good protesters and the bad protesters, or the people who got caught up by the arrests and the people who were the legitimate target of the arrests, even though actually we hadn't done anything unlawful. We were not attempting to do anything unlawful that day. And so, yeah, I tried to stand up and give a short 2-minute pre-prepared speech talking about how our freedom of speech was being taken away and that was a threat to our democracy. And of course, we immediately got bundled out by the security and the police that were at the House of Commons. And it's just, I think it was absolutely hypocritical for them to be holding a committee meeting, looking into the suppression of free speech that happened at the coronation. And as soon as someone tried to speak out about their experience, silencing them and taking them away and threatening them with arrest again. So yeah, it's bizarre. I am worried about the trajectory in which things are heading. And just very briefly before I finish, on the point that you were mentioning previously on the freedom of juries, I certainly know that quite a few of the direct action groups know that, for example, with things like criminal damage, that whether you get sent to a magistrate court or a crown court and you're going to be heard by a magistrate or a jury makes a difference in terms of actually even planning the action, simply because people know that they are more likely to have sympathy from a jury, and therefore they would potentially cause sufficient criminal damage to get seen in a crown court. And I think it's really terrifying if that ability gets taken away.
This account, it's been quite entertaining as well, hasn't it, to have to sneak into fight for the right of free speech and a meeting for free speech. I think that reflects the wider campaign that's going on as well in the bourgeois papers, isn't it? They're all attacking us in the name of free speech. They just want their free speech being heard, not ours, for sure. Agree with you as well, the splitting of protesters between the good ones and the bad ones. No, I think Republic had a bit of a quick political education over the coronation weekend when they actually thought that they're going to have a nice rally there, undisturbed, etc., and came to Trafalgar Square and everything was boarded up. Despite meeting the police the day beforehand. But it shows you really cannot and should never trust the police or the government for that matter. Then they're not our friends for sure. Our next speaker, very pleased to have Huda Amori with us, who is a member of Palestine Action, and I'm sure can tell us about their campaigners being in front of juries and what happens there. Hi Huda.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. So just to start quickly on why Palestine Action formed. We formed in July 2020, and it was in response to the British government, who had been at that point complicit in the colonization of Palestine for over 100 years, and all of the attempts to change this had failed. So we decided to take direct action against Israel's largest arms firm, Elbit Systems. At the time when we started, they had 10 sites across this country. And Elbit actually build weapons which are marketed as battle tested. And they do this because they use the captive population of Gaza, where the majority of the people there are children and refugees, as basically a human laboratory to develop their weapons and then build parts of them over here to both be sent back to be used against Palestinians, but also to be used in other oppressive regimes across the world. And we decided that we had to intervene in this process and to stop them from being able to manufacture their weapons in this country. And that led to our formation. Quite soon after we had taken several different actions at their headquarters, at their different factories across the country, we saw quite quickly that the police and the state were reacting. At first, it was only a few weeks in when there was a meeting between Dominic Raab, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, and the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Benny Gantz, Israel's defense minister. And in this meeting, Israel basically requested that the British government crush our movement. And this was only a few weeks in. And to be honest with you, I was quite happy to see the news. I was quite happy to see how scared they were of the potential of direct action. But it wasn't long after that that I was, along with the other co-founder of Palestine Action, arrested under Schedule 7 at a ferry port, which is counter-terrorism, which is basically where you don't have the right to no comment. So they interrogated us for several hours, all on the basis of Palestine Action, my background, my family, what religion I was, etc. And soon after, myself and 2 others were charged with blackmail. Now, blackmail, we believe it's the first time in over a decade that activists have been charged with it. And they're saying that basically we blackmail landlords into not working with Elbit, even though it's a basic campaign demand. Any decent campaign has a demand and a way of achieving that demand. But there's a lot of political motivation behind this, and we understand that if you're convicted of it, they can ban you. They can put serious crime prevention orders on, where they can ban you from campaigning for as long as they like, basically, from anything to a petition to whatever they like. But despite this, hundreds of people joined Palestine Action. People occupied the roofs of these factories, blockaded them, broke inside their factories and destroyed these weapons. And this led to the closure of their factory in Oldham, which was shut down for good in January last year, and led to them being forced to abandon their London headquarters and them losing hundreds of millions of pounds in contracts, which was brilliant. But obviously there is no victory without struggle. And we continue to see how both in and out of the courts they try and repress activists. And all I see it as intimidation, an attempt to try and stop people and discourage people from taking such action against this criminal enterprise that Elbit is conducting in this country. Now, in our first Crown Court case, which was in London at the end of last year, and it's worth noting that a lot of these trials have been delayed for over 2 years. So these are significant times after the actions took place and after they changed some of the law. So in our first Crown Court case, which involved people throwing red paint over the London headquarters, they were charged with conspiracy to commit criminal damage, and they won the case. They were found not guilty. It was a unanimous verdict, and the jurors was actually blowing them kisses and thanking them for taking such action, which was incredible to see. During that trial, Elbit sent a note taker, which we found out they were paying £250 a day to sit there and take notes. And they actually tried to intervene halfway through the trial because they weren't happy that it was agreed between the prosecutor and the defense, the basic fact that Elbit is an Israeli arms company and that they build drones which are used against Palestinians, even though all of this is basically what Elbit put out every other day on their website. And so they actually tried to intervene, and the CPS changed their line to say that anyone who said they were an arms company was lying. And despite this, they still won, and the judge had to point out that Elbit could be guilty of perverting the course of justice. Obviously, nothing happened to Elbit Systems or their note taker in that case. Since then, we've had more trials, and recently Tony Greenstein's trial as well, where we didn't have the same result, and some of them were convicted. One had a hung jury. But what we're seeing is that the judges are removing the right to have defences. So the right to have these justification defences, such as preventing the greater crime, such as necessity, proportionality, etc., which means that the juries are basically swayed into convicting people because they say there's no legal basis for us taking this action, or that it's too remote in some bizarre way. And so we're seeing that happen more and more, where jurors aren't given the chance to acquit, even though they all have the right to acquit based on their conscience if they are aware of that fact. So we can see how they are trying to, tip the scales into the prosecution's favour. We do have several Crown Court cases coming up, so we do have a chance to keep fighting our corner and fighting our case against Elbit systems and what they do. But interestingly, the Colston case, where people know that people were found not guilty, this was appealed by the Attorney General. Now, they can't appeal the verdict because it was a jury verdict, but they appealed the fact that they had a defense. And this made a precedent which affected us massively in Palestine Action and in other movements, which basically made a distinction between criminal damage on private property and public property. You can basically get away with more on public property than private property. And obviously Elbit is a private arms company. And so this reduced our chances of defences again. And actually recently we got freedom of information requests, which will be put out soon from the Attorney General, showing that they actually had conversations with the Israeli embassy discussing the appeal of the Colston case and also discussing the police and crime and sentencing bill in this country with a foreign apartheid state. And so they're openly, well, not openly, but they are having these conversations with Israel directly. And we will be releasing that information shortly. But more widely, recently we had a mass action at one of the factories in Leicester. And just before it started, they put a Section 14 notice, which basically bans you from being able to be in a certain place without getting arrested. Despite this, several people were camping in the woods and they had no problem. The police didn't stop them, didn't warn them, etc. And then the next day in the morning, while they were sleeping, they came in and arrested 30 people, including a 15-year-old boy. I was actually I was with Richard and we were on the motorway in Stafford, and they stopped us on the motorway, arrested us for conspiracy to commit criminal damage, and transferred us to Leicester in order to hold us, and then release us on bail conditions, several of which we see quite a lot. You know, I'm already banned from Elbit, so they banned me from Elbit again, but this time it was a mile rather than 100 meters. But they put on, most concerning is that they put on, you can't indirectly or directly encourage criminal damage to Elbit. Now, we are Palestine Action. Everything we do, most of what we do is dismantling these Israeli weapons factories. So trying to put these kind of bail conditions on is basically a gagging order to tell you can't talk about Palestine Action, you can't talk about Elbit, and you have to be silent. So we're seeing this attempt to try and silence us, and they're going to have to try harder than that, I'd have to say, because we're not going to be silent when it comes towards them allowing these war criminals to operate on our doorsteps. And also, what we know is that the police and Elbit work very closely together, as you can imagine, to the point where their main security guy, who they had in the last year, he left after a year, was a police officer who we believe was working on Palestine Action cases as a police officer, and then obviously got paid more to work on behalf of Elbit. So we know that they have a very close relationship. And the guy who did his job before that was chief of Staffordshire Police, where they have 2 Elbit factories, where we had someone was on the roof of that factory in 2014. His student was actually killed by an Elbit drone with engines made by the factory he was on top of while he was taking action at this Elbit factory. Now, this guy was chief of the police force at that time. And rather than do anything about what Elbit was doing, he left the police force and started working for Elbit and got paid by Elbit instead. So we understand when we started Palestine Action, part of what we were doing was taking direct action to bypass the government, because we understand that the state works very closely with the apartheid state of Israel and has done for decades. And through taking these type of actions, we can see this more and more, but also we can expose it more and more. And I think from a personal point of view, and for many other people in Palestine Action, if they're going to try and silence us in the courts and silence us anywhere, and they want to try and stack the odds against us when it comes to court, that if we go down, we're definitely going to go down fighting.
Thank you so much, Comrade Huda. That's really important part of the campaign, what Palestine Action is doing against Elbit, and part of the reason why the police and the government are, I believe, taking on juries, because so many of you had been found innocent, and that has embarrassed the government massively. So it's really good to hear from you, comrade. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Deepa Driver, who is a legal observer in the case of Julian Assange, which is obviously not about juries, but it certainly touches on the attacks on our right to protest and, of course, whistleblowers to speak out. Welcome, Deepa.
And it's fantastic to hear Tim, Kush, and Huda speak, and I'm looking forward to hearing Tony. For those of you who are not aware, I have been the legal observer in Julian Assange's case for just over 4 years, since he's been in Belmarsh prison. And outside of this, my day job is as a trade unionist and academic. I was quite moved by some of the things that people were saying here, and the courage that people have. And it is this courage that, seems to be really what the state cannot bear. And this courage is contagious, because it is in conversations like these that we begin to realize that these are not solitary actions taking place. These are actions which deserve our solidarity and where we must come together even more. And one of those cases, which is really at a crucial point right now, is the case of Julian Assange. We are talking about the jury process, but one of the big problems with the case of Julian Assange is he's never had the right to a jury so far. So essentially, the extradition process, extradition law, has been misused by the Americans in order that in Britain, they don't have to prove either beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities that Julian has committed a crime. And that crime, of course, is the crime of journalism as far as the US is concerned, because if you look at the indictment, the second superseding indictment the United States has laid on Julian's door, they are expecting him to serve 175 years. That is, you can call it a life sentence, you can also call it a death sentence, in a US supermax prison, where he will be held in a cell which is 8 by 10 and fed through a hatch in the door. The cell is made of concrete, and you can potentially talk to your prisoners in neighboring cells through the drains. And people drive themselves mad by doing so, and through the solitariness of what the situation entails. So what Julian is facing is a very, very, very extreme prison sentence for obtaining, receiving, and publishing classified information. What was this classified information? It was evidence of serious war crimes, killings, rapes, murders, tortures in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's also evidence of the inhumane and brutal torture of close to 780 Muslim men and boys as young as 14. The youngest prisoner in Guantanamo was, well, not a prisoner, but a child who had been brought, was 3 months old. For revealing the fact that this happened, Julian is being punished. Julian is also, one of the charges, which is the smallest charge, is one which is, or rather one of the small charges is one of a 5-year sentence, which is conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Now, knowing Julian as a brilliant information technologist, people may assume that this is a hacking charge, and this is part of the kind of smearing that the US has been very good at. But it is not. What is it about? It's about a conversation that somebody with the initials NF had with Chelsea Manning, where they said, "Curious eyes never run dry," and where Chelsea Manning asked for help to cover up her tracks in relation to something. Now, this conversation, they have no proof that it was Julian Assange at the other end, but they are basing their allegations on the testimony of a serial convicted pedophile and fraudster, who, to his credit, has admitted in the public domain that this evidence was fabricated at the behest of the FBI. So this kind of rigged case is what Julian is facing in the United States. And pre-trial detention conditions are the supermax conditions that I told you about, but these conditions are determined by the FBI and the CIA. And why is there a problem with the CIA and the FBI determining his pre-trial detention? Well, it's because they plotted to assassinate him while he was within a sovereign embassy, that is the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And in all this time, you know, we've had this juryless process going through, this jury-free process going through as an extradition process. What kinds of judges have we had? One, we've had Lady Emma Arbuthnot, wife of former Defense Minister James Arbuthnot, who clearly has a conflict of interest on account of his close connections with the intelligence services, but also has a potential conflict of interest as a result of her son's investments in a company called Dark Trace, which militates against organizations like WikiLeaks, and who has, according to, and none of this information is mine, according to Declassified UK, has herself received hospitality from those hostile to Assange. And this is somebody who's presided over the entire early extradition process and in fact been involved in 2 of the judgments that were made against Assange. Julian has served for 4 years for a crime he hasn't committed. He is not, I mean, he's still on remand. And it is his birthday on the 3rd of July, and I urge all of you to join in celebration with the various groups around the country. But it's also important to know that this case is also rigged, because the privileged legal conversations that Julian had with his lawyers, and in fact with his doctors and with his friends, were systematically surveilled. We now have evidence which has come out in the last week or so, published by El País, from the Spanish case which has been going on, which shows that the Spanish police didn't release to the judge evidence of a file, which is about however many 100 gig, showing a folder which said for the CIA. And these are the privileged conversations that Julian has had with Gareth Pierce, with Aitor Martinez, with all his lawyers. And finally, you know, the whole court process, I've queued at 3 or 4 a.m. and colleagues, friends and supporters have queued because we were not allowed into court. 40 human rights organizations who had previously been granted access at the Old Bailey had their access removed on the first day of the hearings. But for those of us who stayed and said, okay, we will queue and go into the public gallery, there were 96 seats across the 2 courtrooms. And yet only 2 seats were allowed first thing in the morning for the public, so to speak. So you had to queue for one of those 2 seats. And I mean, 2-meter distance for COVID, for Christ's sake, I mean, how far do you have to be to have only 2 people allowed? But you go in there and they treat you with so much disdain. You have this 80-year-old odd man, Julian's father, climbing up 5 flights of stairs. You know, you have Craig Murray with his heart condition trying to report the hearings, you know, going in with the family as one of the family invitees. And they don't allow you to take in water. You cannot, they say that if they told me on one of the days of the hearings that I could take, as the legal observer, I could take in pen and paper, but I could not write. And Julian himself, when he was moved from Belmarsh prison to come to court, was strip searched twice, moved from cell to cell 5 times, handcuffed, brought to court in the equivalent of an upright coffin. You know, that's what these Serco type vehicles are like. And all of this is part of the dehumanization of a journalist and publisher, while Tony Blair and the war criminals like George Bush are standing, being feted by the British state, which is, you know, glad to be complicit in the imperialist oppression of people, in the destruction of lives in other parts of the world, and then complain about refugees from places where they have destroyed people's livelihoods and completely removed any possibility of people to have a decent life. They don't want to come here. Nobody wants to come here at such great cost. It's only because we are killing people all over the world that this is happening. And it is really important that if we care about refugees, if we care about climate justice, WikiLeaks has published so much. For example, They publish information about toxic waste dumping by Trafigura off the Ivory Coast. It's not just war crimes that WikiLeaks has published. And they've been able to publish this, not just because of the courage and intelligence of Julian Assange and the people at WikiLeaks, it's because of the courage and intelligence of the whistleblowers within these organizations who believe in the true processes of these organizations, not the made up processes by management, but the true processes that in terms of what these organizations should be doing in these other countries, what is decent, and these people who are upholding the law have released this information because they can see that the law is being trampled upon. And so we must protect both whistleblowers and journalists like Assange if we want to know what happens when you have a relative in a care home, what happens when you have a brother in prison, what happens when you have a sister living in Libya. If you want to know the truth about what happens to them, we have to protect WikiLeaks and Assange. And, you know, the misuse, and I'll end here, Tina, just a few, a couple of small points, which are, the law is being used not as an instrument of justice, but as an instrument of injustice. And the fact that British judges and British lawyers are not speaking up against this kind of blatant misuse of the law is something that we need to be deeply concerned about. There is an obstruction and arbitrariness in the state responses to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions, multiple findings, at least two findings, that Julian has been arbitrarily detained. A complete disdain that Julian has been tortured. There are blatant breaches of due process rights, and all the protections that the law affords in relation to extradition have been ignored, as well as, you know, there's been a complete denial of resources. To take away a man's glasses and not allow him to prepare for trial while he's having 175 years in a prison, not allow him to talk to his lawyers, and to have a selective prosecution and a disproportionate sentence is not something we should be allowing, because it's not just Julian Assange. What they do to Assange is the start of what they do to the rest of us. So it is really important we should speak up, and I'll stop there. And I thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very important contribution. I think the case of Julian Assange, as you say, it's about dehumanizing him as a person, but the bigger picture is, of course, it's a deterrent, isn't it? It's a warning sign. This is what will happen to anybody who speaks out and who challenges power, and he's done it in such an effective way with WikiLeaks, has to be said. It's you know, this is showing what we'll do with people who challenge power. The more people participate in such actions, of course, be it publishing things or demonstrating, the harder it will become. And I think we should perhaps also consider the possibility that this is not a sign of strength of the government, but a sign of weakness. Not only are demonstrations, protests increasing, etc., the government is clearly in huge crisis, the British government, but capitalism on a wider scale is in huge crisis. It's not a strong, stable system at the moment. They are struggling on various fronts, not just war in Ukraine, COVID, all these kind of things. Capitalism as a system is nearing its end. And I think all these laws that are coming through now are they're preparing for a time when the working class, the people, will rise up in mass. And I think this is all part of that possibility, which will come again. It might not look like it at the moment, because times are very difficult, and the defeat of the Corbyn movement, I think, has debilitated us to some level. But it will rise again. People will rise again. They always do, always have, and will again. One person rising, and perhaps has to do it for a while from prison, is Tony Greenstein, who's our last speaker from the platform tonight. Comrades, while we have you here, please note that the sentencing will not take place on Monday, as we've advertised far and wide. It has been postponed for a number of reasons. Well, one key reason, but it's probably taking place on July the 10th or even later than that. Again, we'll tell people about this, but solidarity with you, Tony.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can. Yeah. Okay, thanks. And thanks to all the speakers before me for what were extremely interesting contributions. And bearing in mind what Deepa said, the justice system in this country, whatever else it is about, it's not about justice, but it's about maintaining of the existing system, a neoliberal capitalist order. And in times like this, it becomes more and more authoritarian, and not just, of course, in Britain either. We were arrested. I was the driver of a minibus taking a group of Palestine Action activists to Shenstone, which makes engines. It's owned by Albert, and it makes engines for the drones, which are then used to kill Palestinian civilians, but not only Palestinians, people in Myanmar, in Yemen, and many other countries around the world. In other words, it's a serial war crimes committer. And yet, of course, the British government, because of its alliance with the Israeli state and other repressive states, has never taken any action against it. Quite the contrary, it's moved heaven and earth to protect it. It's interesting that when we were arrested, March the 9th, 2021, yes, over 2 years ago, it was the same day as Wayne Couzens was brought before court, charged with the murder and kidnap of Sarah Everard. You may remember he was a Metropolitan Police officer. One of the cardinal rules of law drawn up by Lord Bingham, one of the most famous jurists and a former president of the Supreme Court or the House of Lords, I'm not quite sure which one, was the law of the land should apply equally. It's a third of 8 rules of law. The law of the land should apply equally to all, save to the extent that objective differences justify differentiation. You can see in the case I mentioned of Wayne Couzens, he was twice reported for exposing himself in public. The police were given detailed information, yet did they prosecute? Did they arrest? No, of course, they covered up. And as a result of that, he went on to then commit kidnap and murder. But it's not just Wayne Couzens, of course. I mean, there are many others in the government and in the establishment who also get away literally with breaking the law. I mean, not least our former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I mean, the police eventually and very reluctantly prosecuted him for attending one party at Downing Street. But according to ITN, there were up to 10 such parties. Johnson secured a £100,000 grant when he was mayor of London for his mistress, Jennifer Arcuri, even though her company was based in California, not London. Johnson didn't disclose his interest in the matter, yet there have been no fraud charges, no investigations by the police and so on. But it's not just Johnson. Billions of pounds were fraudulently obtained via the COVID contracts. They even had a VIP lane for the friends and the cronies of Tory ministers and MPs. It was declared unlawful by the High Court, but no one has yet been prosecuted, such as Matt Hancock, who gave his old pub landlord a multi-million-pound contract, or the case, of course, of Lady Mona, who had £200 million worth of contracts, out of which she made £100 million profit. There are some people in this society, in other words, who are immune from the application of the law, but the police will try and find any excuse whatsoever, any pretext to prosecute direct action activists. And that, if you like, is the nature of the justice system that we have, that it's not about justice. And of course, in the case of Julian Assange, I mean, what is his real offense? It's revealing the commission of war crimes by the United States. But no one suggests that those who committed those crimes should be prosecuted. It's the person who played a pivotal part in revealing those crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, who is being prosecuted literally with the full force of the law. And that should tell us something about the impartial or not impartial nature of the justice system that we had. on May the 16th of this year, I, together with 3 other defendants, were convicted of intent to cause criminal damage, which is basically spraying paint over the Shenstone factory of Elbit, after the judge had ruled out all lawful excuses, necessity, human rights defences, proportionality, and so on. But if you look at the Criminal Justice Act, Section 3 of 1971, it says, a person who has anything in his custody or under his control intending, quote, without lawful excuse to use it or cause or permit it to be used to destroy the property of any other person. The key part is without lawful excuse. The judges have ruled, this is judge-made law, it's not statute law, that there are no lawful excuses if you commit criminal damage, because, for example, the fact that Elbit, the Shenstone factory, manufactures engines which go into a drone, which then goes on to kill people, the people who are killed are too remote from the cause of action. And there is a nakedly racist justification for saying basically the British imperialism can maim and plunder abroad without any fear of consequences. There's no other interpretation about it. I mean, imagine in the IG Farben, which was the company that produced cyanide gas, Zyklon B, to murder Jews, gypsies, and other people in Nazi Germany, if their defense had been that you've got to prove which crystal of poison was used to murder which Jewish person, for example, it would be an absurdity. The fact that they're producing this stuff should be a cause in itself. And the same with Elbit. The fact they are manufacturing these weapons with the sole purpose of attacking civilians, and 85% of Israeli drones are Elbit drones, the Hermes 450 in particular, should, I think, give the lie to this idea that there is no lawful excuse. And all of this really began with the acquittal in Colston. I think it was last year. The statue of a slaver, a mass murderer, Edward Colston, was tipped into the Bristol Harbour, and this produced a reaction from all wings of the establishment, from the present Home Secretary, Cruella Braverman, as I call her, but also to Keir Starmer. I mean, there was no political difference across the political spectrum. This was referred to the Court of Appeal, as people have heard, and they decided, A, to set almost to distinguish what was a relatively liberal decision in Ziegler, that proportionality defences could be used in cases of obstruction, to specifically say that in the case of criminal damage, there were, unless it was minimal, there could be no lawful excuse. And you might think that this negates completely Britain's 2001 International Criminal Court Act, which said the commission by British citizens or residents in Britain of war crimes, even those committed abroad, they would be treated as offences that were committed in this country, Section 52 of the Act. Yet despite that, again, you cannot use the International Criminal Court Act as a defence. Now, I mean, it has occurred to me, I mean, we are having, therefore, a very serious attack on the rights of juries. And people have mentioned the Bushel's case. It was in 1670, the prosecution of William Penn and William Mead, when the jury refused to deliver a verdict that they had preached to an unlawful assembly. They said, we're quite happy to find that they did do the preaching, but not to an unlawful assembly. And they were locked up for 2 days and night without food, water, bed pad or whatever you call it, and fire. But they held out. And Edward Bushels, who refused to pay a heavy fine, was imprisoned and then applied successfully for a writ of habeas corpus. Before then, before 1670, juries were widely coerced into delivering the verdict that judges wanted. But after that, it was accepted that the jury could deliver an opinion, a verdict, according, and this is the plaque on the Old Bailey, according to their convictions. And there's been a number of senior legal figures through the years who've backed this up. I mean, let me quote Heather Hallett, who's currently chairing the COVID inquiry and was a Court of Appeal judge from 2005 to 2019. In the Blackstone lecture she gave on the role of juries, and I recommend people to read it, she says, and I quote, "A jury may refuse to convict in spite of the law and the evidence because it concludes that the law is an unjust law. The jury passes its verdict on the law. Secondly, it ensures that the prosecution and the judge are on trial." Similarly, Lord Patrick Devlin, who was a former law lord and a legal scholar, said, "The first object of any tyrant in Whitehall would be to make Parliament utterly subservient to his will." Well, I don't think they have the far to go. And the next, to overthrow or diminish trial by jury. For me, for no tyrant could afford to leave a subject's freedom in the hands of 12 of his countrymen. Trial by jury is more than one wheel of the Constitution. It is the lamp that shows that freedom lives. And Devlin was actually right, because the jury is the only independent element in the British Constitution which isn't in the hands of the executive or their extensions. And Devlin went on to say it gives protection against laws which the ordinary man regards as harsh and oppressive, and insurance that the criminal law will conform to the ordinary man, so he was writing in those times, ideas of what is fair and just. If it does not, the jury will not be a party to its enforcement. And that really is what it's about. And we live in a climate where we've had a wholesale attack on the right to protest, culminating in the Public Order Act of 2023, where you can obtain injunctions and orders to prevent people attending demonstrations, where the police are now entitled, at least according to them, to arrest people even before they get to a demonstration. And the remarkable thing is that you have an establishment consensus that stretches from the Tory party to the Labour Party, because the Labour Party in Parliament abstained on this act and refused to back a fatal motion in the House of Lords moved by Baroness Jenny Jones that would have killed off amendments which had been introduced by secondary legislation when in the primary legislation in a debate in the House of Lords, those amendments had failed. And yet, of course, Keir Starmer simply refused to oppose it. I mean, I think there does need to be a broad and substantial alliance between climate action groups, Palestine solidarity groups, and other groups to roll back this attack on the rights of juries and the rights of defendants to explain why they took the action that they did. Because in my view, I mean, if you go to Article 6 of the Human Rights Act, I mean, it's quite clear. It says, in the determination of his civil rights and obligations or of any criminal charge against him, everyone is entitled to a fair and public hearing within a reasonable time by an independent and impartial tribunal established by law. I mean, the question I would ask is, how can you have a fair trial when you can't explain why you did what you did? You cannot explain your motivation or your reasons for doing what you did. So it's very clear that there's a fundamental attack on the right to a free trial, so that juries are being kept in the dark. I mean, I was amazed when I was on trial, the number of times the jury was sent out. They were unable to hear any of the debate about the law and the things surrounding it in the trial. So, I mean, they had blinkers on. So I wasn't surprised that they came in with guilty verdicts. I predicted that at the very beginning. And so we do have a battle on our hand. I should add, just on a personal note, I mean, we've been on trial for, well, it's been hanging over us for 2.25 years, and it's still going on. So there is a great, if you like, weight and drain on the defendants themselves, because you do have to be able to stand up. And it's extremely wearying, to say the least. But nonetheless, if we don't stand up, then of course no one else will. I've gone on far too long, so I'm going to thank you for listening to me, and let's have some discussion. Thank you, comrades.
Important contribution, and best of luck with you for your sentencing hearing. There is a protest outside the Crown Court in Wolverhampton on the morning of the sentencing, where we could also hold up some of these signs. We have a little bit of time for questions, contributions, but Tim has to leave the meeting. So we thought, because this campaign is really important, perhaps Tim could come in quickly again to perhaps speak a little bit more about it and give a sort of summing up before he has to shoot off, and then we can perhaps bring one or two people in from the floor. So Tim, over to you again.
Well, thank you for accommodating me, Tina. And yeah, sorry, I've got to leave soon. And thank you so much to everyone, to Huda and Deepa and Kush and Tony and Tina for organising this, because we talk a lot about movement of movements. We talk a lot about intersectionality of our movements. We know we're kind of up against one big monster of neoliberal capitalism, and all, you know, in different ways, that's what we're all resisting. But it's quite hard to put that into practice. I mean, it just is, it has been. There are lots of efforts to do that. And what I feel the last hour and a bit has really brought home is this is where we're all intersecting, like in real terms, in practice, around those Crown Courts. And there's a huge opportunity for us to really come together around that. And it's much deeper than just jury trial. I mean, that might be the practical thing, but as Deepa has reminded us, you know, what the 1% is really scared of here is not just the 99% of us, it's the truth. You know, that's why Julian Assange has been so demonized. He's the archetypal truth teller of our age, and that makes him so dangerous. So this is what we're fighting for here, isn't it? It's the right for juries to hear the truth. And that's the other lie that the 1% are afraid of. When the mass of people hear the truth, they don't want what's happening. Nobody votes for death and disaster and the death project we're embarked upon. They don't. You know, we're brilliant when we come together. So thank you so much for this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you on Wednesday at 6:30 and working together.
Thank you very much for taking the initiative and setting up such an important campaign that we really urge all comrades and organizations to get involved in first at the planning stage, and then we certainly can put it out activities when normal people can get involved and hold up placards, etc. Briefing journalists seems important as well, politicians, briefing other lawyers. If lawyers get involved, I think that would also be a very powerful sign to get QCs, barristers, etc. to take part in such a campaign that should get in the papers, etc. So thank you very much, Tim. And I know you have to rush off now. We'll kind of take a couple of comments or contributions, questions from the floor. So if you would like to speak briefly, you please put your hand up. We've had over 100 people in the meeting, which is fantastic and shows that it's an issue that is very important to a lot of comrades and people out there. Hi, Marian.
Hi, I think tonight's meeting's been very, very important and long overdue, really. We've got a battle on our hands. The ruling class is scared of ordinary people taking action and standing up to them. And they're they're developing more and more policies to try and limit what we can and can't do. So what we need now, we need to build mass action, mass demonstrations, mass pickets, and say we defend the right to a trial by jury, and that people to be able to put forward why they committed so-called offences, and we have to do that really strongly. And I think we definitely need a mass demonstration to stop Julian Assange being extradited, because it's true, it's not just him. They're trying to frighten other people, enabling us to know the truth of what's happening. Because obviously Truth is power, knowledge is power. And if people knew what these people were doing in our name, then the people would, well, people are already up in arms about what the government's doing. But I think the Labour leadership and the trade union movement leadership has been bankrupt in their attitude. The very fact that the film on Jeremy Corbyn's having a hard time and Sharon Graham's doing what she's doing is despicable. Now is the time we have to stand up and fight for our rights and fight for proper justice in this country. And that's the key. We can't let them get away with it. It's not the first time they've tried to do away with trial by jury, because that's the key. That's what they hate. The fact that ordinary men and women sit in judgment on their peers, and the state has no control over that. That is why they're trying to take away the right of being able to put forward a defence of why you did something. So I think we have to try and unite together and put pressure on our trade union leadership to actually get off their backsides and stand up for democracy and stand up for justice. And if we haven't got democracy, we've got to fight for it, because otherwise they continue to do what they're doing and we've got to stop them.
Thank you, Conrad. I can't see anybody else with their hand up, so I'm just going to ask if Tony and Deepa want to come in. Sorry, has anybody just said something? No? No. Tony or Deepa, do you want to sum up or reply to anything that you've heard tonight? Deepa, go on. Yeah.
I wanted to say a couple of things. Julian's case is at a very crucial stage now, in a matter of, depending on when the judgment comes from the two judges, in terms of whether an appeal has been accepted, he could be put on a plane and sent away. And that is an unthinkable outcome. And of course, we have the European Court of Human Rights, but things can go wrong very quickly. It is really important that if there is a hearing at the Courts of Appeal in relation to Julian's case, we have a lot of solidarity outside the court, because this battle is not won just inside the court, it's won in the court of public opinion. And the more it is obvious that people care, that this will not be hidden away, and they don't have the excuse of COVID regulations to stop that right now. So please do make yourself available. I also wanted to respond to a question which I got, which I won't disclose the name of the person who asked the question, but because they wanted to stay anonymous. And they asked about, and I'm sure Tony will also have a view on this, and I was hoping Tim might be able to answer it as well, which is, what do you do about judges who behave in this manner, or prosecutors who behave in a manner which is inconsistent with justice? And I think we saw this in Assange's case, for example. At one stage, a judge who heard his name and his date of birth and just basic facts then decided to opine that he was a narcissist. How you can work that out from somebody's name is a complete mystery to me. But in cases like these, it is really important that people take the step to put in requests for misfeasance in public office investigations. And this kind of scrutiny can be done by those who are unable to actually physically, for example, if you're one of those people who's not physically able to get to the courts and to the protest because of where you're located or because of your personal circumstances. These are things that you can do in order to progress the impression, at least, that these people have, that people are watching. And this kind of courage is, as they say, contagious, because the more of us who do it, the more likely it is that people who are in these positions of power realize that they're not unwatched. And the more we watch them, and the more we take action and we build alliances of solidarity, the more we can have the kind of society we want. So I'll stop there, and I hope Tony will also answer the second question, if that's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. Tina, I think it's a real problem when a judge challenging a judge in court. I mean, you, as a defendant, for example, you're confined in a dock protected by glass at the very back of the court, so you're not even really participating. My own view is that the role of lawyers now in many of these cases is almost redundant, because they can't put forward any legal defense because the judge has ruled it out of order in discussions which are held in the absence of a jury. So I think there's a great merit now that where defendants are capable and able, they should be representing themselves and making their own speeches, because in that way it will be much harder for the judge to close them down. I actually tried it in my trial. I sacked my barrister to do the closing speech, but I was prevailed upon, and I won't say by whom, to change my mind. But in retrospect, I actually regret that decision. But I think there needs to be, if you like, a legal strategy, because the legal strategy of our barristers, who mainly came from Garden Court chambers, was to rely on a factual defence. And factual defences, that is, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, and so on, really don't pass muster now. So I really do think there's a need for a complete rethink. I also had a question to Deepa. I'm not sure why, given that political offences are exempted from the Extradition Act, that there isn't an appeal to the Supreme Court on, in other words, leapfrogging the Court of Appeal, which is a deeply reactionary court under Sir Ian Burnett, who's a good friend of Alan Duncan, who's described Julian Assange as a miserable worm in the House of Parliament. He's not a man who is exactly neutral in these respects, but the Supreme Court, I would have thought, would have been the ideal venue. I mean, the second thing is, I have to say that, I mean, I agree with Neil Meltzer's book on the Assange case, when he makes criticism of the defence barristers, when the defence barristers were refused, in essence, access to their own client because of the decisions of the presiding judge, or it was a district judge. I think they should have walked out. I mean, barristers have done that before when judges are unreasonable. And given her failure to recuse herself in the first place, I think the tactics of the lawyers in question are open to quite searing examination. And I think we should lose this mystique of lawyers, by the way, that they're the experts and we have to listen to them. I think we have to actually put them under pressure to do what we want to do, regardless of their professional obligations. My final conclusion on this is, I do think we need to build these pickets of court with signs saying that juries have the right to decide, regardless of what the judges may want them to decide. And I think that's really important, because as I've said, the jury is the only independent element in the British Constitution. They've been eliminated from all civil trials. Defamation was the last. And they're slowly being whittled away from the criminal courts as well, as more offences are tried without a jury. And of course, contempt of court doesn't have a jury to begin with, and a judge can sentence you to 2 years if you defy his orders. So they have a hell of a lot of powers in their hands. And what's, I think, remarkable about the present threats is they're accusing people who hold up these signs of attempting to pervert the course of justice, when it's quite obvious that judges trying to neutralise judges and neutralise juries, rather, they are the ones who are trying to pervert the course of justice. But of course, the weapons are all in their hands, not ours. So it does take mass popular struggle from below to actually effect a change above. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Deepa, do you want to answer that? If you can.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting sleight of hand that they've done, Tony, in relation to the extradition procedures, because the 2003 Extradition Act prohibits extraditions on the grounds of political opinions, whereas the US-UK extradition treaty, which was signed later, includes an exception for political offences. So they've made the request using the treaty, but are saying that under domestic law, Julian does not have the protections of the treaty because the treaty has not been written into domestic law. And David Davies very clearly explained the will of Parliament in a speech. So this is a sleight of hand. The other thing is, second thing I wanted to respond to was criticism of Julian's lawyers. Now, there, I mean, I agree with you that lawyers are not the be-all, not the experts, not the people whom we should necessarily always rely on. But on the other hand, in this particular case, I'm very convinced that what Gareth Pearce and her team are doing are in Julian's best interests. And same with Balthasar Garzon overseas in the global team. I think it's very difficult when a case like this, where 5 states have decided to come together to stamp on a defendant's head, and you're trying to work within a crooked system and a rigged system to try and achieve anything, because there is room for criticism on so many grounds. And lastly, I think, why shouldn't we go to the Supreme Court? You have to be granted permission to get there. And it is that permission that is not being granted, because if he was granted permission to appeal, then they would hear the appeal. If they ruled against him, then you could go to the Supreme Court. But if you're not granted permission to appeal in the first place, then the domestic remedies are exhausted. And your next step is the European Court of Human Rights. Like in the Rwanda case, they can put in an interim, you know, the equivalent of an injunction. Yeah. And so it's a very, very dangerous point right now, because these 2 judges will make the decision.
Can I just ask you, Deepa?
Sure.
You say you have to be granted leave to appeal to the House of Lords, but there are 2 venues you can do that in. The first and most immediately is at the Court of Appeal itself, but you can also appeal to the House of Lords directly for leave to appeal. Has the latter been done yet? I
would have to defer to Julian's lawyers. I have no idea.
Right. Okay, because I've heard nothing about such a refusal. That's why I asked.
I can check and get back to you, Tony, and to
Sure.
other colleagues. But my understanding is, well, as far as I'm aware, the route that has been considered is the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah, no, sure.
From Deepa's remarks there, it shows what a hell the British justice system is, with an unwritten constitution, case law, etc. It is, of course, to stop us from, you know, rising up and from demanding what's just, etc. So there's a really important campaign to protect the jury system, which is, as Tony and Tim in particular have outlined, the only democratic part of the legal system in Britain, really. And we should do everything we can to make sure it is preserved and extended. And, you know, to also, as Tony said, it's not the first time they've tried to cut away on that. And we will be forwarding to everybody who's on the LLA email list all this information, and we've signed up tonight. You'll get information on these on the campaign Save Our Juries. If you want to get involved, if you're part of an organization that wants to take part in a Save Our Juries campaign, please email saveourjuries@protonmail.com or email the LLA and we'll forward it. This is really it shows that you know, laws are not necessarily just. There's a difference between legal and just, and I think Tony's case and other comrades' case at the moment have shown that, and it's really important that we fight that together. So I'm very much welcoming this campaign. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating tonight. We had over 100 people in the meeting, despite the fact that we had to kick out a few people. And apologies for some of the comments that were posted there. It just it shows the quality of the opposition, but it's also, you know, it's a bit pathetic to have to do that. But thank you very much, comrades who were there tonight, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Bye bye, comrades.